Sweden is famous for socialism, IKEA, and neutrality, but one family secretly controls 40% of the Swedish stock market. 40%. The Wallenbergs own Ericsson, control AstraZeneca, dominate Atlas Copco, hold Saab, Electrolux ABB. Companies worth over 300 billion. Thus, they didn't just build Sweden's economy, they are Sweden's economy. For 68 years, 5 generations of one family have run a shadow government inside one of the world's most celebrated democracies. Here's what nobody tells you. During World War II, they did business with the Nazis, and they also produced the man who saved more Jews than Oskar Schindler. Same family, same generation, 2 brothers who took opposite paths. One is celebrated as a hero. The others? They're still running Sweden. This is how one dynasty captured an entire nation, and kept it. If you're fascinated by these hidden power structures, consider subscribing, because what this family did during the war alone will change how you see neutrality forever. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because the Wallenbergs have probably built something in your country too. In 1856, Sweden did not have a modern banking system, so Andrei Oskar Wallenberg decided to build one, and accidentally created a family empire that would outlast every European monarchy. The story begins not in a counting house or a grand estate, but in a bishop's residence in Linköping, where in 1816 a boy was born into a family of faith and learning, but not of fortune. Andrei Oskar Wallenberg grew up surrounded by books and sermons, by the quiet rhythms of provincial Swedish life, by the sense that education was the only ladder available to those without inherited wealth. His father spoke of God and duty. Young Andrei listened, but his eyes were drawn to the horizon, to the ships that moved through Swedish waters carrying goods and possibilities to places he had only read about. Perhaps that is why he chose the Navy, why he became an officer on vessels that would carry him far from the cathedral town of his childhood, far from the expectations of a bishop's son, into a world that was transforming itself through iron and steam and something else entirely, something that moved invisibly through ledgers and letters of credit, something called capital. When Wallenberg travelled to America in the 1830s and 1840s, he saw what money could become when it was organised properly. In New York and Philadelphia, banks were not merely places where wealthy men stored their gold. They were engines, machines that converted deposits into loans, that transformed the savings of thousands into the fuel for railroads and factories and shipping lines. In England, he witnessed the same alchemy on an even grander scale, watching as London's merchant banks financed half the commerce of the known world. And then he returned to Sweden, to a country that seemed frozen in time, where farmers still worked land that had been parcelled out centuries before, where industry was a foreign word, where the very concept of commercial banking barely existed. Sweden in the 1850s was not the Sweden we imagine today. There were no Volvos, no IKEA, no gleaming technology companies, no social democratic welfare state. There was timber and iron ore, yes, but extracting them required capital that simply did not exist in organised form. The Swedish economy functioned largely on barter and personal credit, on relationships between landowners and merchants that had not changed substantially since the Middle Ages. The country had missed the first industrial revolution entirely. Britain had transformed itself into the workshop of the world, while Sweden remained agricultural, peripheral, poor by Western European standards. And yet Andrei Oskar Wallenberg looked at this backwardness and saw not a problem but an opportunity. He understood something that would define his family for generations. When you arrive late to a revolution, you can skip the mistakes everyone else made. You can adopt the best practices that others discovered through painful trial and error. You can build modern institutions on virgin soil without the accumulated debris of outdated systems. Sweden had no banking tradition to overcome. It had no entrenched financial interests to fight. It was a blank canvas, and Wallenberg intended to paint something unprecedented upon it. In 1856, he founded Stockholm's Enskilda Bank, the first private commercial bank in Sweden. The name itself was a statement of intent. Enskilda means private or individual in Swedish, a declaration that this institution would operate outside the ponderous machinery of the state, that it would move with the speed and flexibility that private enterprise demanded. But it was not merely the existence of the bank that mattered, it was the philosophy behind it, the insight that would transform Swedish capitalism and concentrate economic power in ways that even Andrei himself might not have fully anticipated. Most banks of that era operated on a simple model. They took deposits, they made loans, they collected interest, they tried not to lose money. The relationship between bank and borrower was transactional, temporary, defined by the terms of the loan agreement and nothing more. Wallenberg saw something different. He understood that a bank that merely lends money is a servant to industry, but a bank that owns stakes in the companies it finances becomes something else entirely. It becomes a partner, a shareholder, a voice in the boardroom, a power that persists long after the loan has been repaid. This was the genesis of what historians would later call the Swedish model of finance capitalism, the bank-industrial complex that would define this small Scandinavian country's path to prosperity. When Stockholm's Enskilda Bank extended credit to a struggling mining company or a nascent manufacturing firm, it did not simply demand interest. It took equity. It placed its representatives on boards of directors. It wove itself into the fabric of Swedish industry so thoroughly that separating bank from enterprise became impossible, like trying to remove the skeleton from a living body. Let me give you the numbers on where Andrei started. In 1856, Sweden had a GDP of approximately 300 million Swedish krona. Total banking capital in the entire country amounted to roughly 15 million krona. Andrei Oskar Wallenberg founded Stockholm's Enskilda Bank with just 1 million krona in capital, about 6.6% of all banking capital in Sweden from day one. By his death in 1886, the bank controlled over 50 million krona in assets. More importantly, through loans and equity stakes, the bank had financial relationships with companies representing roughly 20% of Sweden's industrial output. One bank, one family, 20% of industrial Sweden in 30 years. But here is the number that matters most. Andrei had 20 children. Not all survived to adulthood, but enough did. He did not just build a bank, he built a dynasty machine. 20 children seems almost absurd to modern sensibilities, a number from a different era when infant mortality was high and large families were both common and necessary. But Andrei Wallenberg was not merely following the customs of his time. He was thinking strategically, perhaps even coldly, about the mathematics of succession. A dynasty requires heirs, multiple heirs who can be trained, tested, selected from among their siblings based on ability and temperament. With 20 children, the odds of producing at least a few who possessed the intelligence, the ambition, and the ruthlessness necessary to continue building an empire became nearly certain. This was not a family. It was a breeding program for capitalists, a genetic lottery designed to ensure that Wallenberg blood would flow through Swedish commerce for generations to come. And flow it did. Andrei raised his sons in the bank, teaching them from childhood that money was not merely a medium of exchange but a form of power, that loans created dependencies, that equity created control, that patience and discretion created opportunities that louder, more obvious men would never see. His sons Knut and Marcus emerged from this education as natural successors, men who had absorbed their father's philosophy so completely that they could extend it into domains he had never imagined. By the time Andrei Oskar Wallenberg died in 1886, the succession was not merely planned, it was already operational. Knut and Marcus had been running significant portions of the family's affairs for years. They knew every debtor, every equity stake, every relationship that their father had cultivated over 3 decades. They understood that the bank was merely the visible portion of something much larger, an iceberg of influence that extended beneath the surface of Swedish society into mining and timber and manufacturing and shipping, and a dozen other sectors that were beginning to transform a backward agricultural nation into something approaching a modern industrial economy. The model that Andrei created would prove remarkably durable, not because it was complicated, but because it was elegant in its simplicity. Control the capital, and you control the companies that need capital. Control the companies, and you control the industries they operate in. Control the industries, and you control the economy. Control the economy, and you become, in practical terms, if not in title, more powerful than any elected official or hereditary monarch. Swedish kings had been losing power for centuries, constrained by parliaments and constitutions and the gradual democratization of European politics. The Wallenbergs were gaining power through mechanisms that no constitution addressed, through private ownership and corporate governance, and the quiet accumulation of shares in companies that most Swedes had never heard of but that shaped their daily lives in ways they could not see. Sweden's late industrialization, which had seemed like a curse, revealed itself as a blessing in disguise. Countries that industrialized early, like Britain, developed their financial systems organically, messily, with competing interests and distributed power centers that made coordination difficult. Sweden could design its financial architecture from scratch with intention, with the concentrated efficiency that comes when a single vision guides development. That vision belonged to André Oskar Wallenberg, and it would persist through his sons and their sons and their sons after them, adapting and expanding but never abandoning the core insight that had made it possible in the first place. Banking relationships become ownership relationships. Ownership relationships become control. Control becomes power. Power, properly managed, becomes permanent. By 1886, André Oskar Wallenberg had proven that a bank could control industries without owning them outright, but his successors faced a problem that would require considerable ingenuity to solve. How do you keep an empire in the family when Swedish law does not allow aristocratic privileges? How do you prevent wealth from dispersing across generations, diluted by inheritance and marriage and the simple mathematics of reproduction? How do you maintain concentrated control in a society that was becoming year by year more democratic, more egalitarian, more suspicious of concentrated power in any form? The answer would require inventing an entirely new form of corporate control, one that would make the Wallenbergs more powerful than any Swedish king had been for centuries. The Wallenbergs invented a system so clever that even after Sweden became one of the most equal societies on earth, they still controlled more wealth than any family in Scandinavia. When André Oskar Wallenberg died in 1886, his sons inherited not merely a bank but a philosophy, a way of thinking about money and power that would prove more valuable than any amount of capital. Knut Agathon Wallenberg, born in 1853, assumed leadership of Stockholm's Enskilda Bank with the steady hand of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. His younger brother Marcus, born in 1874, possessed a different kind of genius, less interested in the mechanics of banking than in the strategic possibilities of industrial development. Together, they would transform their father's creation into something unprecedented in European capitalism, a system of control so elegant and so durable that it would survive 2 world wars, the rise of social democracy, and the complete transformation of Swedish society without losing its grip on the commanding heights of the economy. The problem they faced was simple to state but extraordinarily difficult to solve. Wealth disperses. This is the fundamental law of dynastic decline, the reason why great fortunes rarely survive more than 3 generations. Children inherit, they divide the estate. They have children of their own who divide it further, and within a century the concentrated power of the founder has scattered like seeds in the wind. European aristocracies had solved this problem through primogeniture, the legal principle that the eldest son inherits everything while younger siblings receive nothing or nearly nothing. But Sweden was not friendly to aristocratic privilege. The country was moving steadily toward democracy, toward equality, toward a social order that viewed concentrated hereditary power with deep suspicion. The Wallenbergs could not rely on feudal legal structures that were being dismantled across Europe. They needed something new, something that would achieve the same result through mechanisms that appeared modern and legitimate, something that would allow a family to maintain control across generations without ever appearing to violate the egalitarian principles that Sweden was beginning to embrace. The answer came in 2 interconnected innovations that would define the Wallenberg Empire for the next century. The first was the dual-class share structure. In most companies, ownership and control are synonymous. If you own 51% of a company's shares, you control 51% of the votes, and therefore you control the company. But what if different shares carried different voting rights? What if you could create 2 classes of stock, one that voted and one that did not, or one that carried 10 votes per share, while another carried only 1? Suddenly the mathematics of control change completely. You no longer need to own a majority of a company's economic value to control its destiny. You merely need to own a majority of its voting shares, which might represent a small fraction of its total equity. The Wallenbergs did not invent dual-class shares, but they perfected their use and embedded them so deeply into Swedish corporate law that they became the standard structure for major Swedish companies. A shares carried full voting rights. B. Shares carried reduced voting rights or no voting rights at all. The family accumulated A shares while allowing B shares to trade freely on public markets. Outside investors could buy into Swedish companies, could share in their profits, could benefit from their growth, but they could never threaten Wallenberg control because the shares available to them simply did not carry the votes necessary to challenge the family's position. It was a kind of financial magic trick, the illusion of public ownership masking the reality of private control. The second innovation was even more consequential. Foundations in Swedish law occupy a peculiar position, entities that exist in perpetuity, that pay no inheritance tax, that cannot be sold or divided or distributed to heirs because they have no owners in the conventional sense. A foundation simply exists, governed by a board, pursuing whatever purposes its charter specifies. The Wallenbergs realized that foundations could hold shares. They could hold voting shares. They could hold the A shares that controlled companies while the B shares floated freely in public markets. And because foundations never die, never divorce, never have children who might squander the family fortune, they could maintain control forever. Beginning in the early 20th century, the family began transferring their most valuable holdings into a series of foundations: the Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation, the Marianne and Marcus Wallenberg Foundation, and others that would accumulate over the decades. These foundations were ostensibly charitable, dedicated to supporting Swedish science and education, and they have indeed donated billions of kroner to worthy causes over the years. But their primary function was and remains the preservation of family control. The foundations own the voting shares control the companies, the family controls the foundations through board positions that pass from generation to generation. No inheritance tax is ever paid because technically nothing's ever inherited. The wealth simply remains generation after generation in structures that the family dominates but does not legally own. In 1916, the brothers took the final step in constructing their empire. They founded Investor AB, a holding company that would serve as the central node in a vast web of corporate control. Investor was not a bank and not an operating company. It was something new, a permanent capital vehicle designed to hold stakes in other companies, to exercise control through those stakes, and to persist indefinitely across market cycles and economic disruptions. The Wallenberg Foundations owned the controlling shares of Investor. Investor owned controlling stakes in dozens of Swedish companies. Those companies in turn held stakes in other companies, creating layers of control that multiplied the family's influence far beyond what their direct ownership would suggest. This structure, which financial scholars would later call a pyramid or a cascade, allowed the Wallenbergs to control vast swaths of the Swedish economy while actually owning a relatively small percentage of its total value. The sphere began to take shape, a constellation of companies bound together, not by common ownership but by interlocking boards of directors, by cross-shareholdings, by relationships of mutual dependence and shared interest. Knut Wallenberg sat on the board of ASSIA, the electrical engineering company that would eventually merge with Brown Boveri to form ABB. Marcus Wallenberg cultivated relationships with SKF, the ball-bearing manufacturer that supplied components to industries around the world. Atlas Copco, the industrial equipment maker. Ericsson, the telecommunications pioneer. One by one, the great Swedish industrial companies entered the Wallenberg orbit, not through hostile takeovers or dramatic acquisitions, but through the patient accumulation of influence, through loans that became equity stakes, through board seats that became control, through relationships that deepened over decades until separation became unthinkable. The family motto emerged during these years, 3 Latin words that would define the Wallenberg approach to power for the next century: esse non videri, to be, not to be seen. In an age when other great capitalists sought publicity, when American tycoons built monuments to themselves and courted newspaper coverage of their every move, the Wallenbergs chose invisibility. They gave few interviews, they avoided photographs, they declined honours and rejected the social prominence that their wealth could easily have purchased. This was not modesty, it was strategy. Power that is visible attracts opposition. Wealth that is flaunted generates resentment. In a society moving toward social democracy, toward progressive taxation, toward suspicion of concentrated economic power, the Wallenbergs understood that survival required discretion. They would exercise more influence over Swedish life than any elected politician, but they would do so quietly through private conversations and boardroom decisions, through the gentle pressure that major shareholders can exert without ever raising their voices. The public would know the names of the companies, they would not know who truly controlled them. Here is how the math of control works. Investor AB, founded in 1916, is the Wallenberg Holding Company. Through Investor, the family controls roughly 40% of the Stockholm Stock Exchange's market capitalization, approximately $180 billion in companies as of 2024. But here is the trick. The The Wallenberg Foundations own about 50% of investor AB's voting rights, while owning only about 23% of its economic value. Those foundations own shares with 10 times voting power, so with 23% of the money, they control 50% of the votes. And investor AB itself often controls its portfolio companies with 15 to 25% of shares but 40 to 50% of votes through the same dual-class structure. Stack these pyramids and the leverage becomes extraordinary. The foundations control investor. Investor controls the companies. The Wallenbergs control roughly $300 billion in corporate assets while owning perhaps $30 billion in economic value. That is a 10-to-1 control to ownership ratio. No family in the democratic world has anything close. By 1920, the architecture was complete. The dual-class shares ensured that control could be maintained with minority ownership. The foundations ensured that control would never be diluted by inheritance or taxation. Investor AB provided a permanent vehicle for coordinating the family's interests across dozens of companies. The interlocking boards created a sphere of mutual support where Wallenberg allies sat on each other's boards, voted for each other's proposals, and defended each other against outside interference. Swedish corporate law, shaped in part by Wallenberg influence, protected these structures rather than challenging them. The system was not merely legal, it was celebrated as a model of responsible long-term capitalism, a way of ensuring that Swedish companies would be governed by patient owners with generational time horizons rather than short-term speculators seeking quick profits. And perhaps there was truth in this defense. The Wallenberg companies did tend to invest for the long term. They did tend to maintain employment during downturns. They did tend to support Swedish research and development in ways that purely profit-maximizing owners might not. But the benevolence of the system did not change its fundamental nature. This was concentrated power, dynastic power, power that had found a way to perpetuate itself in a democratic society by making itself invisible, by wrapping itself in the language of philanthropy and responsible capitalism, by becoming so embedded in Swedish life that challenging it seemed not merely difficult but somehow unpatriotic. The banks and the industrial companies and the foundations and the holding companies formed a single organism, a creature that fed on Swedish prosperity and grew with Swedish growth, that had no natural predators because it had shaped the legal ecosystem to eliminate them. Knut Wallenberg managed the financial side of this empire with conservative precision, ensuring that the bank remained solid through the economic turbulence of the early 20th century. Marcus Wallenberg ranged more widely, building relationships with industrialists across Europe, identifying opportunities for Swedish companies to expand internationally, thinking strategically about which industries would define the coming century. Together they demonstrated that the Wallenberg system was not dependent on any single individual. The structure they had built could accommodate different personalities, different strengths, different visions, as long as the fundamental commitment to family control remained intact. Sons were being groomed for succession. The next generation was learning the family business. The machine that Andrei had started and his sons had perfected would continue operating generation after generation, converting Swedish economic growth into Wallenberg power with the efficiency of a well-designed engine. By 1920, the Wallenbergs had built a control machine that no economic downturn could destroy and no government could dismantle. But then came a test that would reveal the true nature of their power and their morality. In 1939, war came to Europe. Sweden declared neutrality, and the Wallenbergs had to decide which side would be better for business. While Nazi Germany murdered millions, Sweden stayed neutral, and the Wallenbergs did business with everyone. This is the chapter of the family history that no one wants to discuss, the years between 39 and 45 when the machinery of control that the Wallenbergs had so carefully constructed was put to its most morally ambiguous use. Sweden's neutrality during the Second World War is remembered today as a wise policy that kept a small nation out of a catastrophic conflict, and perhaps it was. But neutrality is not the same as innocence, and the Wallenbergs understood better than anyone that war creates opportunities for those positioned to exploit them. Two brothers would define the family's conduct during these years, each representing a different aspect of the Wallenberg character. Marcus Wallenberg Jr., born in 1809, was the diplomat, the smooth negotiator who could charm Allied officials while simultaneously maintaining relationships with German industrialists. His older brother Jacob, born in 1892, was harder, more direct, more willing to engage with the darkest elements of the Nazi regime if business required it. Together, they navigated the most dangerous period in European history, emerging with the family fortune not merely intact but substantially enhanced, while the question of what that fortune cost in human terms would haunt their legacy forever. To understand what the Wallenbergs did during the war, you must first understand what Sweden had that the world wanted: iron ore. The mines of northern Sweden produce some of the highest quality iron ore in Europe, essential for steel production, essential for weapons, essential for the machines of industrial warfare. Germany had coal but limited iron. Sweden had iron but limited coal. The economic logic of exchange was overwhelming, and it had been operating for decades before the war began. Swedish ore travelled by rail to the Norwegian port of Narvik, or through the Baltic Sea to German ports, feeding the furnaces of the Ruhr Valley, becoming the steel that became the tanks and guns and bombs of the Wehrmacht. When war broke out in September 1939, the trade continued. When Germany invaded Norway and Denmark in April 1940, the trade continued. When Germany turned east and began the systematic murder of millions of Jews and Slavs and Roma, the trade continued. Sweden was neutral, and neutral countries trade with all parties to a conflict. This was the official position, and it was legally defensible. But the Wallenbergs were not merely passive beneficiaries of Swedish trade policy. They were active participants, shapers of that policy, men whose companies depended on German contracts and whose banks financed the very industries that supplied the Nazi war machine. The connection ran deeper than iron ore. SKF, the ball-bearing manufacturer that had entered the Wallenberg sphere before the First World War, produced components without which modern machinery cannot function. Ball bearings reduce friction. They allow shafts to rotate smoothly, wheels to turn efficiently, engines to operate without destroying themselves. Every tank needs ball bearings, every airplane needs ball bearings, every submarine, every truck, every artillery piece, every machine tool in every factory producing weapons of war needs ball bearings. And SKF was one of the largest ball bearing manufacturers in the world, with factories in Sweden, in Germany, in the United States, in Britain. The company was perfectly positioned to supply all sides of the conflict, and that is precisely what it did. The Allies knew this. American and British intelligence had mapped the supply chains of German war production with meticulous care, and they understood exactly how much Sweden contributed to the Nazi war effort. Diplomatic pressure began almost immediately, demands that Sweden reduce its exports to Germany, that SKF stop supplying bearings to German factories, that the neutral nation recognize its moral obligation to the countries fighting fascism. The Wallenbergs faced these demands with the same cool calculation that characterized all their business dealings. Complete capitulation to Allied demands would have meant economic ruin and possible German invasion. Complete defiance would have meant post-war blacklisting and exclusion from American markets. The path they chose was neither. It was negotiation, delay, partial compliance, promises made and partially kept. A constant balancing act designed to maintain relationships with both sides while committing fully to neither. Marcus Wallenberg Jr. became the primary interlocutor with the Allies, travelling to London and Washington, meeting with officials who despised what Sweden was doing but needed Swedish cooperation for other purposes. He was charming and apologetic, always promising to do more, always explaining the difficulties of the Swedish position, always buying time. Meanwhile, his brother Jacob was conducting very different negotiations. Jacob Wallenberg had maintained relationships with German industrialists throughout the pre-war period. He knew the men who ran the great German corporations, had sat on boards with them, had conducted business that made both sides wealthy. When war came, these relationships did not disappear. They became more valuable, more sensitive, more dangerous. Jacob travelled to Germany during the war years, meeting with business partners whose companies now operated within the Nazi system, whose factories might be using slave labour, whose profits derived from the conquest and exploitation of occupied Europe. The most troubling of these meetings involved Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the architect of the Holocaust, the man responsible for the murder of 6 million Jews. In 1945, as the war was clearly lost, Himmler began seeking channels to negotiate with the Western Allies, hoping perhaps to save himself or to split the Allied coalition, or simply to find some way out of the catastrophe he had helped create. Jacob Wallenberg was one of the intermediaries he approached, using their pre-existing business connections as a bridge to what Himmler imagined might be a separate peace with the West. The negotiations went nowhere. The Allies were committed to unconditional surrender, and Himmler had nothing to offer that could change that position. But the fact that Jacob Wallenberg was considered a suitable channel, that he had the connections and the credibility to serve as an intermediary with the leadership of the SS, tells us something about how deeply the family was embedded in the German power structure. This was not a neutral businessman being approached by a desperate war criminal. This was a relationship cultivated over years, now being called upon in extremity. The family's defenders would later argue that Jacob was gathering intelligence for the Allies, that his German contacts provided valuable information about Nazi intentions and capabilities. Perhaps there is truth in this. The line between espionage and business is often blurry, and men like Jacob Wallenberg operated in spaces where the distinction barely existed. But intelligence gathering does not explain the trade that continued year after year, the iron ore that kept flowing, the ball bearings that kept German factories running. The numbers tell a damning story. Between 1940 and 1944, Sweden exported approximately 10 million tons of iron ore per year to Nazi Germany, roughly 40% of Germany's iron imports. SKF, the ball-bearing company controlled by the Wallenbergs, supplied an estimated 600,000 bearings annually to Germany, despite explicit Allied requests to stop. The Allies calculated that without Swedish iron ore and ball bearings, German war production would have collapsed 18 months sooner. Do that math. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. 18 months earlier would be November 1943, before D-Day, before the Battle of the Bulge, before hundreds of thousands of additional deaths on all sides. How much was Swedish neutrality worth? Historian estimates suggest Swedish war trade with Germany was worth approximately 500 million kroner annually, roughly $2 billion in today's money per year. The Wallenbergs did not start the war, but they may have extended it. The family defences always rested on two arguments. First, that they had no choice, that German invasion was a constant threat, that cutting off trade would have meant occupation and the loss of everything. Second, that they actually helped the Allied cause in ways that cannot be easily measured, by providing intelligence, by maintaining channels of communication, by preserving Swedish independence as a potential base for future operations. Both arguments contain elements of truth. Germany did consider invading Sweden at various points, and the Swedish government's careful accommodation of German demands probably did reduce the likelihood of attack. And Swedish neutrality did provide certain benefits to the Allies, including a haven for refugees and a channel for diplomatic communication. But these arguments do not fully address the moral question. The Wallenbergs were not merely following government policy, they were helping to shape it. Their representatives sat on the boards that made decisions about what to export and to whom. Their banks financed the trade, their profits depended on its continuation. They had agency, and they used that agency to maximize their commercial interests, while millions died in camps and on battlefields that Swedish iron ore and Swedish ball bearings helped to supply. The pivot came slowly, as pivots in such situations always do. By 1943, it was becoming clear that Germany would lose the war. The tide had turned at Stalingrad and in North Africa. American industrial capacity was overwhelming German production. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but when, and smart businessmen began positioning themselves for the post-war world. The Wallenbergs reduced their German exposure gradually, blaming Allied pressure, blaming transportation difficulties, blaming anything that allowed them to maintain relationships with German partners, while signalling to the Allies that Sweden was moving in the right direction. Marcus Wallenberg Jr. intensified his contacts with American and British officials, presenting himself as a friend of the West who had always been constrained by circumstances beyond his control. The family's American investments, which had been frozen during the war, would need to be recovered. The post-war order would be shaped by the victors, and the Wallenbergs intended to be on the winning side when the shooting stopped. By early 1945, Swedish trade with Germany had fallen dramatically, not because of moral awakening, but because Germany was collapsing and could no longer pay. The iron ore trains still ran, but they ran less frequently. The ball bearings still shipped, but in smaller quantities. The relationship that had sustained both the Swedish economy and the German war machine for 5 years was winding down, not with a dramatic rupture, but with the quiet diminishment that comes when a customer can no longer place orders. When victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, the Wallenbergs were ready for what came next. They had maintained their allied relationships despite everything. They had preserved their industrial empire despite the disruptions of war. They had money in American banks that would soon be unfrozen. They had companies positioned to benefit from European reconstruction. The moral questions would be asked. Investigations would be launched. Names would be added to blacklists and then quietly removed. But the fundamental position of the family was secure. They had done what the Wallenbergs always did. They had survived. They had adapted. They had emerged from crisis stronger than they entered it. The system of control that their fathers and grandfathers had built proved resilient, even in the face of the greatest catastrophe in European history. The foundations still held their shares. The holding companies still controlled their subsidiaries. The sphere still existed, ready to expand into the opportunities that peace would bring. While Jacob and Marcus Wallenberg were negotiating with Nazis and counting profits, another member of the family was doing something very different. In the summer of 1944, a young diplomat named Raoul Wallenberg arrived in Budapest with a single mission: to save as many Jews as possible from the Holocaust. What he did next would make him the most famous Wallenberg in history and the family's greatest mystery. Raoul Wallenberg rescued more Jews from the Holocaust than Oskar Schindler, and then the Soviets made him disappear forever. This is the story that does not fit, the chapter in the Wallenberg Chronicle that refuses to align with everything else we know about this family of careful calculators and patient accumulators of power. While his cousins Jacob and Marcus were negotiating with Nazi industrialists and ensuring that Swedish iron ore continued flowing to German steel mills, a younger member of the family was engaged in something entirely different, something that would cost him his freedom and almost certainly his life, something that would make his name immortal while raising uncomfortable questions about why the most powerful family in Sweden could not or would not save him. Raoul Wallenberg was born in 1912, 3 months after his father died of cancer. He came from a different branch of the family tree, descended from a brother of the banking dynasty's founder, rather than from the direct line that controlled Stockholm's Enskilda Bank and its industrial empire. His grandfather had been a diplomat rather than a banker, his father a naval officer who never lived to see his son's first birthday. The connection to great wealth was real but distant, close enough to bear the famous name, far enough that Raoul would need to make his own way in the world. His mother remarried, and Raoul grew up with the awareness that he was a Wallenberg, but not quite a Wallenberg, part of the clan but not at its centre, carrying expectations that came with the name without the resources that normally accompanied them. His grandfather Gustav took a particular interest in the boy, perhaps seeing in this fatherless child a project worthy of a retired diplomat's attention. Gustav sent young Raoul abroad for education, first to Paris, then to America, where he enrolled at the University of Michigan to study architecture. It was an unusual choice for a Wallenberg. The family produced bankers and industrialists, not artists or designers, but Raoul had talents that did not fit the family mould, a gift for languages, an ease with people from all backgrounds, a restlessness that would not be satisfied by sitting in a Stockholm office managing investments. After Michigan, Gustav arranged for Raoul to work in Haifa, then part of British Palestine, at a trading company run by a Jewish partner. It was in 1936, and Europe was darkening. Anti-Jewish laws were spreading across the continent. Refugees were flooding into Palestine, bringing stories of persecution that would soon seem mild compared to what was coming. Raoul spent 6 months there, learning about banking and trade, but also absorbing something else, an understanding of what it meant to be hunted, to be stateless, to have no protection except what others chose to provide. He travelled to South Africa on business, returned to Sweden, struggled to find a position that matched his abilities. The family name opened doors, but Raoul seemed unable to settle, moving from opportunity to opportunity without finding his place. By the early 40s, he was working for a Hungarian Jewish businessman named Kalman Lauer, helping to manage a trading company that imported specialty foods from occupied Europe. It was through Lauer that Raoul learned about Hungary, about its Jewish community, about the precarious situation of Jews in a country allied with Nazi Germany, but not yet subjected to the full machinery of the Holocaust. Everything changed in March 1944, when German forces occupied Hungary and Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest to supervise the deportation of the last major Jewish community in Europe. Within weeks, the killing machine was operating at full speed. Jews in the Hungarian countryside were rounded up, packed into cattle cars, transported to Auschwitz, murdered in gas chambers. By July, over 430,000 Hungarian Jews had been deported, most of them killed within hours of arrival at the death camp. Only the Jews of Budapest remained, approximately 200,000 people living in a city that was rapidly becoming a trap. The American War Refugee Board, established by President Roosevelt in January 2004, was searching desperately for ways to intervene. Traditional diplomacy had failed, military rescue was impossible, but neutral countries still maintained embassies in Budapest, and neutral diplomats enjoyed protections that might be extended in some creative fashion to at least some of the Jews awaiting deportation. Sweden was approached. The Swedish government was cautious, aware of the risks, uncertain whether intervention would accomplish anything except antagonizing Germany. But someone suggested Raoul Wallenberg, the young man with the famous name who had connections in Hungary through his business dealings, who spoke German and French and English, who had shown himself adaptable and resourceful in difficult situations. In July 1944, Raoul arrived in Budapest as a secretary to the Swedish legation, carrying diplomatic credentials and something far more important, authorization to do whatever was necessary to save lives. What he did over the following 6 months defied every expectation of what a diplomat could accomplish in the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The tool he invented was simple and brilliant. He called it the Schutzpass, a protective passport, an official-looking document covered with Swedish symbols and stamps and signatures, declaring that the bearer was under the protection of the Swedish crown and would be transported to Sweden as soon as circumstances permitted. The document had no legal validity whatsoever. Sweden had no authority to extend citizenship or protection to Hungarian Jews, and the Swedish government certainly had not authorized the creation of tens of thousands of fake passports. But the Schutzpass looked official, and in the chaos of wartime Budapest, appearance was everything. Nazi bureaucrats were trained to respect documents, to defer to paperwork, to follow procedures even when those procedures made no sense. When a confident young diplomat waved an impressive-looking paper and demanded that a prisoner be released, the instinct of the functionary was to comply rather than risk making a mistake. Raoul exploited this psychology ruthlessly, bluffing his way past guards, bribing officials, threatening investigations, playing on German fears of post-war accountability. He was everywhere, at railway stations where deportation trains were loading, at the gates of labour camps, at the offices of Hungarian fascists who were killing Jews with increasing savagery as the war turned against Germany. He established safe houses across Budapest, buildings declared Swedish territory where Jews could shelter under the fictional protection of a neutral flag. He hired hundreds of people, Jews and non-Jews alike, to staff an operation that grew far beyond anything his government had authorized, spending money that came partly from American sources, partly from Jewish organizations, partly from his own pocket and whatever he could borrow from the family name. He confronted Eichmann directly on at least one occasion, dining with the architect of genocide, looking into the eyes of a man who had sent hundreds of thousands to their deaths and negotiating for the lives of those who remained. The Nazis despised him. The Hungarian fascists, the Arrow Cross, wanted him dead. But somehow he survived, protected perhaps by his diplomatic status, perhaps by the chaos of a collapsing regime, perhaps simply by luck that would not last forever. As Soviet forces approached Budapest in late 1944, the situation grew even more dangerous. The Arrow Cross, knowing that German defeat was imminent, accelerated their killing, marching Jews to the banks of the Danube and shooting them into the river, conducting house-to-house raids in search of anyone who had escaped the deportations. Raoul worked around the clock, issuing passes, negotiating with officials, physically pulling people off death marches. He had become something more than a diplomat, something more than a rescuer. He had become a symbol of what one person could do when they refused to accept that nothing could be done. The numbers around Raoul Wallenberg are staggering. In 6 months in Budapest, he issued approximately 400 official Swedish Schutzpasses, but printed and distributed perhaps 10 times that number, over 45,000 protective documents. He established 32 safe houses in Budapest, protecting approximately 10,000 Jews at any given time. His actions, combined with other neutral diplomats he coordinated with, are credited with saving between 20,000 and 100,000 lives depending on how you count. By comparison, Oskar Schindler saved approximately 1/200. After his disappearance, Sweden made 30 official requests to the Soviet Union for information. They received nothing credible. The family controlled companies worth billions of dollars. They had relationships with governments worldwide. Yet for decades they could not or would not pressure the Soviets effectively. Raoul was declared legally dead in 2016. He would have been 104 years old. His body has never been found. The truth about his fate remains one of the 20th century's enduring mysteries. In January 1945, Soviet forces completed their encirclement of Budapest. Raoul Wallenberg saw the liberation he had been waiting for, the end of the Nazi occupation that had made his work necessary. On January 17th, he left his headquarters to meet with Soviet military commanders, apparently hoping to coordinate relief efforts and ensure the protection of the Jews he had saved. He was accompanied by his driver and a Soviet escort. He was never seen in the West again. What happened to Raoul Wallenberg after that January day has been the subject of investigation, speculation and controversy for nearly 80 years. The Soviet government initially denied any knowledge of his whereabouts, then admitted in 1957 that he had been arrested and claimed he had died of a heart attack in a Soviet prison in July. Almost no one believed this account. Witnesses reported seeing Wallenberg in various Soviet prisons years after his alleged death. Former inmates described conversations with a Swedish prisoner who matched his description. The Soviet archives, when they were partially opened after the Cold War, yielded fragments of information but no definitive answers. Why would the Soviets arrest a Swedish diplomat who had spent 6 months saving Jews from the Nazis? The most common theory is that they suspected him of espionage, of being an American agent using humanitarian work as cover for intelligence gathering. His mission had been funded partly by the War Refugee Board, an American government agency. His contacts in Budapest included people who would later be accused of working for Western intelligence services. In the paranoid atmosphere of Stalinist Russia, where foreigners were automatically suspect and connections to America were grounds for imprisonment, Raoul's profile was exactly the kind that would attract attention from the NKVD. But espionage suspicion does not explain why he was never released, never exchanged, never allowed to return home even after Stalin's death when other prisoners were freed. It does not explain why the Soviet government maintained a fiction about his fate for decades, refusing to provide Sweden with any credible account of what had happened. It does not explain why, if he died in 1947, his body was never returned, his personal effects never released, his imprisonment never acknowledged. Something about Raoul Wallenberg was important enough to the Soviet authorities that they kept him hidden, denied his existence, and allowed his mystery to persist even when openness might have served their interests. The question that haunts the Wallenberg family most painfully is what they did, or failed to do, to secure his release. The Swedish government's response was notably weak for decades, making formal inquiries but never applying serious pressure on Moscow, never allowing the Wallenberg case to disrupt the broader relationship between Sweden and the Soviet Union. Trade continued. Diplomatic norms were observed. Sweden needed Soviet goodwill, or at least Soviet neutrality, and a single missing diplomat was apparently not worth jeopardizing those interests. But the Wallenberg family was not the Swedish government. The Wallenbergs controlled vast economic resources, maintained relationships with governments and corporations worldwide, and had demonstrated repeatedly their ability to influence events when their interests were at stake. Why did they not use that power to rescue Raoul? Why did they not threaten to withdraw investments, to mobilize international opinion, to make the Soviet Union pay a price for holding their cousin? The family's defenders point out that the Cold War constrained everyone's options, that confronting the Soviet Union was genuinely dangerous, that the Wallenbergs did make efforts behind the scenes that have never been fully documented. Critics suggest something darker, that Raoul was not quite important enough to the family's core interests, that risking commercial relationships with the Soviet bloc was a price they were unwilling to pay, that the banking Wallenbergs had never fully embraced their humanitarian cousin, and were not prepared to sacrifice their business empire for his sake. The truth probably lies somewhere in the complexity between these positions, in a family that was neither heroically committed to rescue nor cynically indifferent, but simply unable or unwilling to do what would have been necessary to force Soviet cooperation. The contrast with Raoul's own behaviour is painful. He had risked everything to save strangers. His family, with all their power and connections, could not save him. Raoul Wallenberg's heroism cast a long shadow over his family, but while the world remembers him, the other Wallenbergs were busy doing what they had always done, building power. The post-war decades would see the Wallenberg empire grow larger than ever, and Swedish social democracy would learn to coexist with its private rulers in ways that seem impossible from the outside. Sweden built the world's most famous welfare state, and the Wallenbergs got richer than ever. This is the paradox that confounds anyone trying to understand Swedish capitalism, the strange coexistence of radical egalitarianism and concentrated dynastic power that defined the second half of the 20th century. When the war ended in 1945, Sweden emerged in an enviable position. Its factories were intact, its cities unbombed, its workforce healthy and educated, its neutrality having preserved it from the devastation that had flattened Germany and exhausted Britain and France. The Social Democratic Party, which had governed since 1932 and would continue governing until 1976, faced a choice that would shape the nation for generations. They could nationalise industry, as the British Labour Party was doing, transferring private enterprises to state ownership in the name of socialist principles. Or they could pursue a different path, one that would achieve socialist goals through taxation and regulation, while leaving the ownership of productive assets in private hands. They chose the second option, and in doing so they created the conditions for the greatest expansion of Wallenberg power in the family's history. The man who would personify Swedish capitalism during these decades was Marcus Wallenberg Jr., the same man who had navigated the moral complexities of wartime neutrality and emerged with his reputation largely intact. Born in 1989, Marcus had grown up within the family system, trained from childhood to assume leadership, educated in the intricacies of finance and industrial management. By the end of the war, he was ready to step into the role that would define his life, the unofficial position that Swedes would come to call simply Mr. Sweden. He was not the head of government, he held no elected office, but for 4 decades, no significant decision about the Swedish economy was made without his involvement, his approval, or at least his acquiescence. Foreign leaders visiting Stockholm would meet with the Prime Minister, but they would also meet with Marcus Wallenberg, understanding that the two conversations were equally important for anyone hoping to do business in Sweden. The Social Democrats and the Wallenbergs developed a relationship that outsiders found difficult to comprehend. These were socialists, committed in principle to the redistribution of wealth, to the empowerment of workers, to the creation of a society where accidents of birth would not determine life outcomes. And yet they not only tolerated but actively preserved a system of corporate control that kept vast economic power concentrated in a single family. The explanation lies in understanding what each side needed from the other. The Social Democrats needed revenue. Their ambitious plans for universal healthcare, free education, generous pensions, and comprehensive social insurance required enormous amounts of money that could only come from taxing a productive economy. They could nationalise industries, but nationalised industries in other countries were proving inefficient, politicised, resistant to innovation. Private companies motivated by profit tended to perform better, and better performing companies generated more tax revenue. The Wallenbergs controlled the best performing companies in Sweden. Their sphere included ACA, the electrical engineering giant. It included SKF, still the world leader in ball bearings. It included Atlas Copco, whose industrial equipment was sold worldwide. It included Ericsson, whose telecommunications technology was becoming increasingly important as the world connected itself through telephone networks. These companies were profitable, innovative, and growing. They employed hundreds of thousands of Swedes. They paid enormous sums in corporate taxes. They were, in short, the golden geese that laid the eggs the welfare state distributed. Killing them, or even seriously wounding them through clumsy nationalisation, would have undermined the entire social democratic project. The Wallenbergs, for their part, needed political protection. Their control structures, the dual-class shares and the tax-exempt foundations and the pyramidal holding companies existed at the pleasure of the Swedish parliament. A determined government could have outlawed these mechanisms, could have forced the dispersal of concentrated ownership, could have made Sweden look more like America or Britain, where such arrangements were either illegal or impractical. The Social Democrats chose not to do this, and their choice was not merely passive tolerance. They actively defended the Swedish corporate governance system against critics who argued that concentrated ownership was incompatible with democratic values. The argument they made was subtle, and in its own way compelling. Concentrated ownership created accountability. When a single family controlled a company across generations, they could not extract short-term profits and walk away. Their reputation was bound to the company's long-term success. They would invest in research and development, in worker training, in the kind of patient capital formation that quarterly earnings pressure made difficult for widely held corporations. The Wallenbergs were not absentee owners or financial engineers. They were stewards, custodians of Swedish industrial capacity, partners with labour and government in building a prosperous society. This was not entirely propaganda. The Wallenberg companies did tend to invest more heavily in research than their international competitors. They did tend to maintain employment during downturns rather than immediately resorting to layoffs. They did tend to take long views, accepting lower returns today for stronger positions tomorrow. Whether this was because of concentrated ownership or despite it, whether the Wallenbergs were genuinely better stewards than dispersed shareholders would have been, remains debated by economists to this day. But the perception mattered as much as the reality. The Social Democrats believed, or convinced themselves to believe, that the Wallenberg system served Swedish interests, and they built their economic policy around preserving it. The grand bargain that emerged was never written down, never formally acknowledged, but it shaped Swedish political economy for half a century. The Wallenbergs would accept high taxes on their companies and on themselves personally. The top marginal income tax rate in Sweden reached 87%, a level that would have provoked revolution in America. The Wallenbergs paid these taxes, or at least they paid whatever their accountants could not legally avoid. They did not flee to tax havens, did not renounce their citizenship, did not wage political war against the welfare state. In return, the Social Democrats would preserve the control structures that allowed the family to maintain its position generation after generation. The foundations would remain tax-exempt. The dual-class shares would remain legal. The holding company pyramids would remain undisturbed. The Wallenbergs would keep their power, and the Social Democrats would keep the tax revenue that power generated. Both sides honoured the bargain for decades. The Swedish model, as it came to be known internationally, was not merely high taxes and generous benefits. It was a specific institutional arrangement that combined egalitarian social policy with concentrated corporate ownership that redistributed income while preserving wealth, that empowered unions while protecting capitalists from the ultimate threat of expropriation. It was a system that could only work because both sides trusted each other to maintain their end of the deal, and that trust was built on decades of relationship between social democratic politicians and Wallenberg executives who understood that their fates were intertwined. Marcus Wallenberg Jr. cultivated these relationships with the same care his grandfather had applied to building the original bank. He was not a political conservative in the American sense, not an opponent of the welfare state or an advocate for minimal government. He accepted, perhaps even genuinely believed in, the Swedish social contract. He served on government commissions and advisory boards. He contributed his expertise to policy discussions. He was, in the terminology of a later era, a stakeholder capitalist, someone who understood that business success depended on social license, that companies could only thrive in societies that were stable, educated, and reasonably content. The welfare state was not his enemy, it was his operating environment, and he adapted to it as the Wallenbergs had always adapted to whatever conditions history presented. The post-war decades brought expansion into new industries that would define the modern Wallenberg sphere. Pharmaceuticals emerged as a growth area, and the family acquired stakes in companies that would eventually consolidate into major drug manufacturers. Aerospace became strategically important as the Cold War intensified, and Sweden sought to maintain an independent defence capability. Saab, originally an acronym for Svenska Aeroplan Aktiebolaget or Swedish Aeroplane Company Limited, had been founded during the war to build fighter aircraft for the Swedish Air Force. After the war, it diversified into automobiles, producing distinctive cars that developed a cult following among consumers who valued Swedish engineering. Saab remained within the Wallenberg orbit throughout these decades, receiving the patient capital that allowed it to develop new aircraft designs and automobile models without the pressure for immediate returns that publicly traded companies faced. Ericsson grew into the crown jewel of the empire. Telecommunications was transforming the world, and Ericsson was at the forefront of that transformation. The company built telephone exchanges and switching equipment, laying the infrastructure that connected voices across continents. As mobile telephony emerged in the 1980s, Ericsson positioned itself to become one of the dominant players in an industry that would reshape human communication. The Wallenbergs understood earlier than most that telecommunications was not merely a business but a strategic asset, technology that would become as essential to modern life as electricity or transportation. They invested heavily, protected Ericsson from foreign takeover attempts, and ensured that one of the world's most important technology companies would remain under Swedish, which meant Wallenberg control. The Swedish model's numbers seem contradictory until you understand the Wallenberg factor. In 1980, Sweden had the highest marginal income tax rate in the developed world at 87%, yet the Wallenberg sphere controlled companies representing 43% of the Stockholm Stock Exchange's market capitalization. How? The foundations. The Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation, the largest, was worth approximately $17 billion by 2020 and pays zero taxes because it is a charitable organization legally. The foundations give away roughly $250 million annually to scientific research, and that is not nothing. But they also maintain voting control over Investor AB, which controls the empire. During the Social Democratic era from 1932 to 1976, Swedish GDP grew from approximately $1 billion to $100 billion. Wallenberg-controlled companies grew faster than the economy. By 1970, one family controlled companies employing approximately 40% of Sweden's industrial workforce. The socialists built the welfare state. The Wallenbergs built the companies that paid for it. The relationship between the family and the state deepened in ways that went beyond formal politics. Wallenberg executives moved into government positions and government officials moved into Wallenberg companies. The boundaries between public and private sectors became permeable, with expertise flowing in both directions. This was not corruption in the crude sense of bribery or self-dealing, it was something more sophisticated, a fusion of interests so complete that distinguishing between what was good for Sweden and what was good for the Wallenbergs became genuinely difficult. When Marcus Wallenberg advocated for a particular industrial policy, he could sincerely believe he was speaking for the national interest, because in his mind, the national interest and Wallenberg interests had become identical. Critics existed, of course. The Left Party, further left than the Social Democrats, argued that concentrated ownership was fundamentally incompatible with democracy, that no family should wield such power regardless of how benevolently they exercised it. Academic economists questioned whether the Swedish model was truly efficient or merely captured by special interests who had convinced themselves and others that their privileges served the common good. Journalists occasionally investigated the family, documenting the extent of their holdings, questioning the cozy relationships between business and government. But these critics remained marginal. The Swedish public, enjoying rising living standards and comprehensive social services, had little appetite for disrupting an arrangement that seemed to work. The Wallenbergs, following their motto of being rather than being seen, kept their heads down, avoided ostentation, contributed to charitable causes, and let the system they had helped design operate without dramatic intervention. By 1990, the family had been accumulating power for over a century. 5 generations of Wallenbergs had built, expanded, and defended an empire that controlled much of Swedish industry. They had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of social democracy, and the transformation of Sweden from an agricultural backwater into one of the world's most prosperous nations. They had adapted to every challenge, turned every crisis into an opportunity, and emerged from each test stronger than before. The system they had created seemed permanent, as enduring as the Swedish bedrock itself. The foundations would exist forever, holding shares that would never be sold. The control structures would pass from generation to generation, ensuring that Wallenberg children yet unborn would inherit positions of power that their ancestors had established. The Swedish model, with its strange marriage of socialism and dynastic capitalism, had proven its resilience across decades. There seemed no reason to believe it would not continue indefinitely, a unique arrangement that other countries might envy but could never replicate. The Swedish model worked beautifully for the Wallenbergs until the 90s. Then globalization arrived, and suddenly a family empire built for a small Nordic country had to compete on a world stage. What the Wallenbergs did next would transform them from Swedish royalty into global power brokers. And it started with a crisis that almost destroyed everything. In 1991, Sweden's banking system collapsed, and the Wallenbergs used the crisis to go global. The decade that had seemed so promising at its start, with the Cold War ending and markets opening worldwide, began with a disaster that threatened to undo everything the family had built over 5 generations. Sweden had experienced a classic boom and bust cycle, the kind that economists describe in textbooks, but that feels like chaos when you are living through it. During the late 80s, financial deregulation had unleashed a flood of credit that poured into real estate, inflating property values to levels that bore no relationship to underlying economic reality. banks lent recklessly, developers built speculatively, and ordinary Swedes borrowed against homes whose values seemed only to rise. Then the bubble burst. Property prices collapsed by 50% or more in some markets. Borrowers defaulted. Banks found themselves holding assets worth a fraction of what they had paid. The entire Swedish financial system teetered on the edge of catastrophe, threatening to drag the real economy down with it. For the Wallenbergs, this crisis struck at the heart of their empire. Banking had been the foundation of everything since André Oskar Wallenberg founded Stockholm's Enskilda Bank in 1856. The bank was not merely an asset among many. It was the original source of the family's power, the institution through which they had financed Swedish industrialization and accumulated the relationships that became the Wallenberg sphere. Now that bank was in trouble, its loan portfolio contaminated by the same toxic real estate exposure that was destroying its competitors. The Swedish government intervened with a massive bailout program that would later be studied worldwide as a model for handling financial crises. Banks were recapitalized, bad assets were transferred to government entities, and the system was stabilized at enormous public expense. Stockholm's Enskilda Bank survived, but the family recognized that the old model of Swedish banking could not continue. The country was too small, its markets too limited, its institutions too vulnerable to the kind of speculative excess that had nearly destroyed them. The response was consolidation. In 1972, Stockholm's Enskilda Bank had merged with Skandinaviska Banken to form Skandinaviska Enskilda Banken, known as SEB. The Wallenbergs maintained their controlling position through the familiar mechanisms of dual-class shares and foundation ownership. After the crisis of the early 90s, SEB emerged as one of the survivors in a banking sector that had been dramatically thinned by failure and forced mergers. But the family's ambitions now extended far beyond Swedish banking. The man who guided the Wallenbergs through this period was Peter Wallenberg, born in 1926, the son of Marcus Wallenberg Jr., who had been Mr. Sweden for so many decades. Peter had grown up in the shadow of his father's enormous reputation, had been trained in the family traditions, had assumed leadership positions in Investor AB and the various foundations that controlled the empire. He was more reserved than his father, less comfortable with the public role that Swedish capitalism seemed to require of its leading figure. But he possessed the strategic intelligence that the family valued above all other qualities, the ability to see opportunities where others saw only threats, to think in decades rather than quarters, to make decisions that would position the Wallenberg sphere for generations to come. Peter understood that Sweden's integration into the global economy, accelerated by the country's entry into the European Union in 1995, created both dangers and possibilities for the family empire. Swedish companies that had grown large within a protected domestic market now faced competition from foreign giants with deeper pockets and broader reach. The old strategy of controlling Swedish industry through Swedish institutions was becoming obsolete. If the Wallenbergs wanted to maintain their position, they would need to transform their Swedish companies into global competitors, even if that meant sharing control with foreign partners, even if that meant operating in a world where the cosy relationships between business and government that had served them so well in Sweden could not be replicated. The template for this transformation had been established even before the banking crisis, with the creation of ABB. In 1988, ASEA, the Swedish electrical engineering company that had been part of the Wallenberg sphere for generations, merged with Brown Boveri, a Swiss and German industrial conglomerate of comparable size and scope. The merger created one of the world's largest engineering companies, a global enterprise with operations spanning continents and capabilities ranging from power generation to robotics. The Wallenbergs did not own a majority of ABB. Their stake was modest by their Swedish standards, but they had negotiated the merger carefully, ensuring that their representatives would occupy key board positions, that the company would maintain significant operations in Sweden, that their voice would carry weight disproportionate to their economic ownership. This was the Wallenberg playbook for globalization. You could not control a global company the way you controlled a Swedish one. The numbers were too large, the shareholders too dispersed, the regulatory environments too varied. But you could influence a global company, could shape its strategy and culture, could ensure that it remained connected to Swedish interests even as it operated worldwide. Influence rather than control became the operating principle for the family's international expansion. The pharmaceutical industry offered another opportunity for global positioning. Astra, a Swedish drug company in which the Wallenbergs held a significant stake, had developed Losec, a medication for treating ulcers that became one of the best-selling drugs in the world during the 1990s. The revenues from Losec transformed Astra into a major player in global pharmaceuticals, but the company remained small compared to the giants that dominated the industry. In 1999, Astra merged with Zeneca, a British pharmaceutical company, to create AstraZeneca. The merger was controversial in Sweden, where many viewed it as the loss of a national champion to foreign control. The combined company would be headquartered in London, not Stockholm. The British partner was larger and would dominate the management structure. But the Wallenbergs, through Investor AB, maintained a significant shareholding in the merged entity, and their representatives continued to serve on the board. AstraZeneca would go on to become one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, its vaccines and treatments reaching hundreds of millions of patients globally. The Wallenberg stake, though smaller in percentage terms than their holdings in purely Swedish companies, represented an enormous amount of value and a position of influence in one of the most important industries of the 21st century. Ericsson presented a different set of challenges and opportunities. The telecommunications company had been part of the Wallenberg sphere since the early 20th century, and it had grown into one of the largest and most technologically sophisticated companies in the world. The mobile phone revolution of the 90s and 2000s made Ericsson a household name. Its handsets competed with Nokia for dominance in a market that was expanding faster than anyone had predicted. Its network equipment enabled the construction of cellular infrastructure across the globe. At its peak around 2000, Ericsson was one of the most valuable companies in Europe, and the Wallenberg stake was worth tens of billions of dollars. But the telecommunications industry was brutally competitive, and Ericsson's position proved more fragile than it appeared. The company's mobile phone business, which had seemed so promising, was overtaken first by Nokia and then destroyed entirely by the smartphone revolution that Apple initiated in 2007. Ericsson exited the handset business, focusing instead on network infrastructure where it maintained stronger competitive advantages. The Wallenbergs watched billions in paper wealth evaporate during the early 2000s as Ericsson's stock price collapsed, but they did not panic, did not sell their stake in desperation, did not abandon a company that had been central to their empire for a century. This was the advantage of patient capital, of ownership structures designed for generational time horizons. A hedge fund or activist investor would have demanded immediate changes, would have pressured management to cut costs and return capital, would have pushed for a sale if the stock price did not recover quickly. The Wallenbergs simply waited, confident that Ericsson's technological capabilities and market position would eventually generate value, even if the path was longer and more painful than anyone had anticipated. The succession question that had been managed so carefully across 4 generations became urgent as Peter Wallenberg aged. He had led the family through the banking crisis, through globalization, through the transformation of Swedish companies into international enterprises, but he could not lead forever, and the 5th generation needed to assume responsibility. 2 cousins emerged as the leaders of this generation, confusingly sharing the same first names as the brothers who had guided the family through the world wars. Jacob Wallenberg, born in 1956, and Marcus Wallenberg, born in 1956 as well, represented different branches of the family tree, but shared the training and expectations that came with being born Wallenberg. They had both worked within the family companies, had both served on the boards of Investor AB and its portfolio companies, had both demonstrated the intelligence and temperament that leadership required. The transition was managed as smoothly as such transitions can be, with Peter gradually stepping back from operational responsibilities while the cousins assumed greater authority. Peter Wallenberg died in 2015, and by that time the 5th generation was firmly in control, continuing the strategies he had established while adapting to new challenges that he had not anticipated. The globalization numbers are staggering. In 1990, the Wallenberg sphere controlled companies with total revenues of approximately $50 billion, almost all generated in Sweden. By 2010, the sphere controlled companies with combined revenues exceeding $150 billion, and over 80% of that revenue came from outside Sweden. Take AB, formed in 1988 through the merger of Swedish SCA and Swiss-German Braun Boveri. Today it has 105,000 employees in 100 countries and revenues of $30 billion. Wallenbergs control approximately 11% of votes. AstraZeneca was formed in 1999 from Swedish Astra and British Zeneca. Now employing 83,000 people globally with revenues of $45 billion, the Wallenberg Foundations hold roughly 4% of votes through Investor AB but maintain decisive board influence. During the 2008 global financial crisis, Investor AB's assets dropped 40% from $35 billion to $21 billion. By 2023, they had grown to over $70 billion. The fifth generation did not just preserve the empire, they doubled it. The 2008 financial crisis tested the globalized Wallenberg empire in ways that the Swedish crisis of the early 90s had not. This was not a regional property bubble, but a worldwide collapse of financial markets, a freezing of credit that threatened to bring down banks and corporations across every developed economy. Investor AB's portfolio companies were exposed to the crisis through their customers, their suppliers, their financing arrangements. Stock prices plummeted, dividends were cut, the entire architecture of global capitalism seemed to be crumbling. The Wallenbergs responded as they had always responded to crises, with patience and long-term thinking. They did not sell at the bottom, did not retreat from their international positions, did not abandon the strategy of global influence that Peter had established. They took advantage of depressed prices to increase their stakes in companies they believed would recover. They provided capital to portfolio companies that needed support to survive the liquidity freeze. They acted as stabilizing forces in markets gripped by panic, demonstrating the value of patient, long-term ownership precisely when short-term investors were fleeing for safety. The recovery, when it came, vindicated their approach. The stock prices of Investor AB's holdings rebounded, then exceeded their pre-crisis levels. The global companies in which the Wallenbergs held stakes emerged from the crisis stronger than before, having used the downturn to restructure operations, acquire weakened competitors, and position themselves for growth in the recovering world economy. The fifth generation had passed its first major test, proving that the family's approach to capitalism could function in a globalized world as effectively as it had functioned in the Swedish context where it was originally developed. But globalization brought more than economic challenges. It brought scrutiny from people who did not share Swedish assumptions about the relationship between concentrated ownership and democratic society, who asked questions that Swedes had learned not to ask, who wondered whether it was healthy for so much power to rest in the hands of a single family, regardless of how responsibly that power seemed to be exercised. Global expansion brought global scrutiny, and in the 21st century, questions that Swedes had learned not to ask started coming from outside. Who are these people who control so much? Is it healthy for a democracy to have an unelected family controlling 40% of its economy? The Wallenbergs were about to face something they had avoided for 150 years, public criticism at home. For 60 years, Swedes accepted Wallenberg dominance as natural until journalists and academics started connecting the dots. The questions had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of Swedish public discourse, but they had been suppressed by a combination of national pride, economic self-interest, and the family's deliberate cultivation of invisibility. The Wallenbergs had followed their motto so successfully, had been rather than been seen for so long, that most Swedes simply did not think about who controlled the companies where they worked, whose decisions shaped the industrial landscape of their nation, whose foundations determined which scientific research received funding and which did not. But the second decade of the 21st century brought changes that made the old silence increasingly difficult to maintain. The internet democratized information, allowing anyone with curiosity to trace the web of cross-shareholdings and interlocking boards that constituted the Wallenberg sphere. A new generation of journalists, less deferential to established power than their predecessors, began asking uncomfortable questions. Academic researchers, influenced by international debates about corporate governance and income inequality, started examining whether the Swedish model of concentrated ownership actually served the public interest or merely the interests of those who concentrated the ownership. And events within the Wallenberg Empire itself provided ammunition for critics who had long argued that unchecked power inevitably corrupts, regardless of how benevolent its exercise might appear. The Ericsson scandal broke open the carefully maintained image of the Wallenberg companies as responsible corporate citizens operating above the ethical compromises that plagued lesser enterprises. Investigations by American and Swedish authorities revealed that Ericsson had engaged in systematic bribery across multiple countries, paying off government officials and intermediaries to secure telecommunications contracts in markets where corruption was endemic. The company had maintained slush funds, had falsified records, had created elaborate schemes to channel money to people who could influence purchasing decisions. This was not a matter of a few rogue employees acting without authorization. The corruption was institutional, embedded in the way Ericsson did business in certain regions, tolerated or ignored by the management at levels high enough to have stopped it if they had chosen to do so. The fines were staggering. Ericsson paid over $1 billion to settle charges with the United States Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the largest corporate penalty in Swedish history. The company entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, essentially admitting criminal conduct while avoiding a formal conviction that would have had even more devastating consequences for its ability to operate globally. Additional penalties followed in Sweden, and the scandal prompted investigations into whether other Wallenberg-controlled companies had engaged in similar practices. The family's response was what you might expect from people trained across generations in the management of reputation. They expressed appropriate dismay. They supported the payment of fines. They backed management changes designed to prevent future misconduct. They positioned themselves as victims of employees who had betrayed the values the family had always championed, rather than as principals who had failed in their oversight responsibilities. The Wallenbergs controlled Ericsson through their usual mechanisms, held significant voting power, appointed board members, influenced strategic decisions. If corruption had become embedded in the company's operations, it had happened on their watch under their supervision. But accountability, in the Swedish system, flowed in directions that protected those at the top. Managers were replaced, fines were paid. The fundamental ownership structure remained untouched. The Saab automobile debacle revealed a different kind of failure, not ethical but strategic. The car company that had been a symbol of Swedish engineering, that had produced distinctive vehicles beloved by a certain kind of consumer who valued safety and Scandinavian design, had been struggling for decades. The Wallenbergs had sold Saab Automobile to General Motors in 2000, ending direct family control of the automotive operations while retaining the aerospace and defense business under the Saab name. The logic was sound from a portfolio management perspective. Automobiles were a brutally competitive business with thin margins and massive capital requirements. General Motors had the scale to invest in new platforms and global distribution that a small Swedish manufacturer could never achieve independently. But the marriage was unhappy from the start. General Motors never quite knew what to do with its Swedish acquisition, vacillating between integration and independence, starving Saab of investment during periods of corporate distress, failing to give the brand a coherent identity in an increasingly crowded market. When General Motors itself collapsed during the 2008 financial crisis and required a government bailout, Saab Automobile became an orphan, a small struggling unit that its bankrupt parent was desperate to shed. A series of increasingly implausible buyers emerged and then retreated, and in 2011 Saab Automobile filed for bankruptcy, ending production of cars that had been manufactured continuously since 1949. The loss of Saab Automobile was not technically a Wallenberg failure since they had sold the company a decade before its demise, but it represented something symbolically important, the end of a Swedish industrial legacy that had been nurtured within the Wallenberg sphere for 60 years. If the family's purpose was to steward Swedish industry, to preserve and develop the productive capacity of the nation, then Saab Automobile's fate raised questions about whether that stewardship extended only to profitable enterprises, whether the patient capital the Wallenberg supposedly provided was really just capital-seeking returns like any other, whether the elaborate justifications for concentrated ownership dissolved when the math stopped working. The European Union posed a more fundamental threat to the Wallenberg model than any corporate scandal or business failure. EU regulators had long been sceptical of dual-class share structures, viewing them as mechanisms that allowed controlling shareholders to extract private benefits while shielding themselves from market discipline. The European Commission pushed repeatedly for harmonisation of corporate governance standards across member states, and those standards generally disfavoured the kind of voting disparities that enabled the Wallenberg foundations to control companies with minority economic ownership. Swedish governments had resisted these pressures, defending the dual-class system as a legitimate expression of national corporate culture, as a structure that promoted long-term investment and responsible ownership. But the pressure continued, and each new EU directive raised the possibility that Sweden would eventually be forced to choose between its traditional governance arrangements and full participation in European capital markets. The Wallenbergs understood that elimination of dual-class shares would end their control virtually overnight. Without 10-to-1 voting advantages, Their foundation holdings would become minority stakes with minority influence, still valuable as financial assets but stripped of the power that made them the foundation of a family empire. They lobbied against EU harmonization, funded academic research defending concentrated ownership, made the case that Swedish exceptionalism should be preserved in the name of diversity and subsidiarity. So far they had succeeded, but the threat remained, a sword suspended above the entire structure they had built over 160 years. The rise of new Swedish technology companies outside the Wallenberg sphere raised different questions about the family's relevance to contemporary Swedish capitalism. Spotify, the music streaming service that became one of the most valuable technology companies in Europe, was founded in Stockholm in 2006 and grew into a global giant without any Wallenberg involvement. Klarna, the payments company that pioneered buy now pay later services, achieved a valuation exceeding $40 billion at its peak, and the Wallenbergs had no stake. These companies represented a new model of Swedish entrepreneurship, venture capital funded, globally oriented from birth, led by founders who had no connection to the old industrial establishment and no interest in joining its structures. The Wallenberg model had been designed for capital-intensive industries where patient long-term investment provided competitive advantages for manufacturing and telecommunications and pharmaceuticals where scale mattered, and relationships with governments could determine market access. The new technology companies operated differently. They needed speed rather than patience, disruption rather than stability, the ability to fail fast and pivot quickly rather than the steady accumulation of position over decades. The venture capital investors who funded Spotify and Klarna wanted exit opportunities, liquidity events where they could realize returns and recycle capital into new bets. They were not interested in dual-class shares that would lock up their investments or foundation structures that would prevent sales. The Swedish startup ecosystem that produced these companies developed largely parallel to the Wallenberg sphere, drawing on the same educated workforce and stable society, but financing itself through Silicon Valley connections rather than Stockholm banking relationships. This posed an existential question for the Wallenberg model. If the most dynamic sectors of the 21st century economy would develop outside traditional corporate structures, if the next generation of world-changing companies would be built by founders who raised money from Sequoia and Andreessen Horowitz rather than Investor AB, then what role would the Wallenbergs play in Sweden's economic future? They would still control their legacy companies, still collect dividends from Ericsson and Atlas Copco and ABB. But they would be stewards of the past rather than architects of the future, a museum exhibit rather than a living force. Media investigations intensified during these years, with journalists documenting the full scope of Wallenberg holdings in ways that had never been systematically presented to the Swedish public. The foundation system received particular scrutiny. These tax-exempt entities controlled tens of billions of dollars in assets, wielded decisive influence over major corporations, and operated with minimal transparency. They were legally required to pursue charitable purposes, and they did distribute hundreds of millions annually to scientific research and educational institutions. But they also served as vehicles for perpetuating family control, for concentrating power in ways that would be impossible if the shares they held were subject to inheritance taxes and dispersed among heirs over generations. Critics asked whether this arrangement truly served the public interest. The foundations were not democratic institutions. Their boards were dominated by Wallenberg family members and longtime associates. The charitable grants they made, while substantial, were directed according to priorities the family determined rather than through any public process. The scientific research they funded was valuable, but it was also research that enhanced the reputation of the Wallenberg name, that built relationships with universities and scientists who might be reluctant to criticize their benefactors. The whole system, seen from a certain angle, looked less like philanthropy than like reputation laundering, a way of converting economic power into social legitimacy while avoiding the taxes that ordinary wealth would incur. The vulnerability numbers are real. The Ericsson bribery settlements totaled over $1 billion in fines to United States and Swedish authorities, the largest corporate penalty in Swedish history. Saab Automobile, sold to General Motors in 2000, went bankrupt in 2011, ending a 60-year Wallenberg legacy in cars. European Union regulations have forced Swedish companies to consider eliminating dual-class shares, and if fully implemented, this could end Wallenberg control overnight. But here is the counter-argument. The Wallenberg Foundations now give away approximately $250 to $300 million per year to scientific research. They have funded 2 Nobel Prizes. Their companies still employ approximately 700,000 people worldwide. Total taxes paid by Wallenberg sphere companies to Sweden amount to approximately $10 billion annually. The Wallenberg Foundations own assets worth roughly $35 billion, making them among the largest charitable foundations in Europe. Is this enough to justify almost 60 years of concentrated power? Sweden has never fully decided. The current generation of family leadership has responded to criticism with a combination of increased philanthropy and decreased visibility. Jacob Wallenberg and Marcus Wallenberg, the cousins who now guide the empire, have given more interviews than their predecessors, have attempted to explain and justify the family's role in Swedish society, have positioned themselves as responsible stewards rather than grasping plutocrats. The foundations have expanded their giving, have funded more research, have associated the Wallenberg name with scientific progress and educational excellence. If the family cannot escape scrutiny, they seem to have calculated. They can at least shape the narrative, can ensure that coverage of their wealth and power is balanced by coverage of their contributions and responsibilities. The debate continues without resolution because Sweden itself remains ambivalent about its relationship with concentrated economic power. The social democratic tradition that shaped modern Swedish society was never fully socialist, never committed to the elimination of private ownership, never willing to trade the dynamism of market competition for the security of state control. The Wallenbergs fit awkwardly into this tradition, representing a kind of private power that social democrats elsewhere would find intolerable, but that Swedish social democrats learned to accommodate and even to rely upon. The taxes their companies pay fund the welfare state. The jobs their companies provide sustain Swedish prosperity. The stability their long-term ownership creates protects Swedish workers from the disruptions of quarterly capitalism. These are not trivial benefits, and they complicate any such simple condemnation of the Wallenberg model. Yet the discomfort persists, the sense that something is wrong when a single family controls so much of a democratic nation's economy, when power is inherited rather than earned, when the accident of birth determines who shapes the industrial landscape for generations. The questions that journalists and academics have raised cannot be unasked, and each new scandal or failure provides fresh ammunition for critics who believe that Sweden has deferred too long to its unelected economic royalty. The family has survived every previous challenge through adaptation, through patience, through the simple persistence of structures designed to endure across centuries. Whether they can survive the challenges of the 21st century remains to be seen. Criticism has not toppled the Wallenbergs. The foundation structure has survived every challenge. The dual-class shares remain, and the 6th generation is already being groomed. But dynasties do not last forever, and the forces that could finally end Wallenberg dominance are now visible on the horizon. The Wallenbergs have survived world wars, communism, socialism, and globalization, but the next generation may face something they cannot defeat: irrelevance. This is the chapter that has not yet been written, the future that the family is preparing for, even as the forces that could undo everything they have built gather strength on multiple fronts. Jacob Wallenberg and Marcus Wallenberg, the cousins who have led the 5th generation through globalization and financial crisis, are now 68 years old. They have held power for decades, have guided the empire through transformations that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors, have proven that the Wallenberg model can function in a world vastly different from the Sweden where Oskar Wallenberg founded his bank in 1856. But they cannot hold power forever. The biological clock that governs all dynasties is ticking, and somewhere in the sprawling family tree, successors must be identified, trained, and positioned to assume responsibilities that have been accumulating for 6 generations. The succession challenge facing the Wallenbergs today is unlike anything the family has confronted before. In earlier generations, the path was clearer. Sons were groomed from childhood, brought into the bank or the holding company, tested in positions of increasing responsibility, and eventually elevated to leadership when their fathers stepped aside. The family was smaller then, the candidates fewer, the selection process more straightforward. But 6 generations of reproduction have created a family structure of daunting complexity. The 5th generation includes approximately 25 members who might theoretically play roles in managing the empire. The 6th generation, the children and grandchildren of those 25, numbers over 100. Not all of them want to be involved in business. Not all of them have the aptitude or temperament that family leadership requires. Not all of them even live in Sweden, having scattered across the world as global citizens whose connection to their Swedish heritage may be more nominal than operational. The legal structures that hold the empire together were designed to accommodate this expansion without fragmenting control. The Wallenberg Foundations are self-perpetuating institutions whose boards select their own successors according to criteria established in their founding documents. Family members are appointed to these boards, and they in turn appoint other family members when vacancies arise. Outsiders cannot buy their way in, cannot accumulate shares and demand board representation, cannot use the mechanisms of shareholder democracy that govern ordinary corporations. The foundations exist outside the normal rules of capital markets, perpetual entities that answer to their own charters, rather than to investors or voters or any external authority. This insularity has preserved family control across generations, but it creates its own problems. Without market discipline, without the threat of hostile takeovers or activist campaigns, the foundations can become complacent, their leadership increasingly detached from the competitive pressures that force ordinary companies to adapt or die. The family members who sit on foundation boards may be chosen for their bloodline rather than their business acumen, their loyalty to family traditions rather than their ability to navigate a rapidly changing world. The Wallenbergs have generally avoided the worst manifestations of dynastic decay, the incompetent heirs and dissolute playboys who have destroyed other family fortunes, but the larger the family grows, the harder it becomes to ensure that talent rather than birth determines who exercises power. The technology disruption that is reshaping the global economy poses a particular challenge to the Wallenberg model. The family built its empire in industries where capital intensity and long-time horizons created natural advantages for patient investors. Steel mills and ball-bearing factories and telecommunications networks require enormous upfront investments that take years or decades to generate returns. Banks and holding companies that could provide this patient capital, that could wait out business cycles and support companies through temporary difficulties, possess genuine competitive advantages over more impatient sources of financing. But the technology companies that are driving 21st century economic growth operate on different principles. Software scales without factories. Network effects create winner-take-all dynamics that reward speed over patience. The most valuable companies in the world today, the Apples and Googles and Amazons, were built not by patient industrial capital, but by venture investors willing to lose money for years in pursuit of exponential growth. Sweden has produced its own technology champions in this new economy, and they have grown almost entirely outside the Wallenberg sphere. Spotify transformed how the world consumes music, building a platform with hundreds of millions of users and a market capitalization that at times exceeded the value of many traditional Wallenberg holdings. Daniel Ek, its founder, raised money from American venture capitalists and built a company whose culture and governance reflected Silicon Valley norms rather than Swedish industrial traditions. Klarna disrupted consumer finance with its buy now, pay later model, achieving a valuation that briefly exceeded $40 billion and making its founder, Sebastian Siemiatkowski, one of the richest people in Sweden. These entrepreneurs owe nothing to the Wallenbergs. They did not need the family's capital or connections or approval to build their companies. They represent a new model of Swedish success that developed in parallel to the old industrial establishment, drawing on the same educated workforce and stable society, but accessing global capital markets rather than local banking relationships. If this pattern continues, if the most dynamic sectors of the Swedish economy continue to develop outside the Wallenberg sphere, then the family's relevance will gradually diminish regardless of how well they manage their existing holdings. They will become curators of an industrial heritage, rather than shapers of an economic future, their control confined to legacy businesses whose importance slowly fades as new industries emerge and grow. The succession numbers are complicated. The fifth generation has approximately 25 members eligible to potentially play roles in the family empire. The sixth generation numbers is over 100. The Wallenberg Foundations collectively control approximately $35 billion in assets. If divided equally among 100 sixth-generation heirs, that would amount to $350 million each, wealthy by any normal standard but not dynasty-controlling wealthy. The legal structures keep the family together. Foundation boards are self-selecting, seats pass to designated heirs, outsiders cannot get in. But here is the tension. Spotify and Klarna were founded in Stockholm, grew to combined valuations exceeding $50 billion, and the Wallenbergs have no meaningful stake in either. The next generation of Swedish billionaires, Daniel Ek and Sebastian Siemiatkowski, owe nothing to the old dynasty. Investor AB's total assets amount to approximately $70 billion. The Stockholm Stock Exchange's total market capitalization is approximately $900 billion. That 40% control figure is shrinking as new companies emerge outside the sphere. In 1970, Wallenberg companies represented 43% of the Swedish market. Today the figure is closer to 35%, still enormous by any measure, but the trend line is clear. The environmental and social governance revolution presents another set of challenges that the Wallenbergs did not anticipate when they built their industrial empire. The companies they control include heavy manufacturers, aerospace contractors, and telecommunications equipment makers whose environmental footprints and supply chain practices face increasing scrutiny from investors, regulators, and consumers. The metrics by which corporate success is measured are shifting away from pure financial returns toward more complex assessments that include carbon emissions, labour practices, diversity, and community impact. The Wallenbergs have adapted to these pressures as they have adapted to previous challenges, investing in sustainability initiatives, publishing ESG reports, positioning their companies as responsible actors in the transition to a cleaner economy. But the fundamental model of concentrated industrial ownership fits awkwardly with the democratizing impulses of the ESG movement, which emphasizes stakeholder voice and corporate accountability to communities beyond shareholders. A foundation-controlled dynasty that answers to no external authority is precisely the kind of governance structure that ESG advocates view with suspicion, regardless of how responsibly that authority might be exercised. The Chinese challenge looms particularly large over Ericsson, still the crown jewel of the Wallenberg portfolio, despite the scandals and setbacks of recent years. Huawei and ZTE, the Chinese telecommunications equipment giants, have emerged as formidable competitors in the global race to build fifth-generation wireless networks. They offer equipment at prices that Western manufacturers struggle to match, backed by state support that blurs the line between commercial competition and geopolitical strategy. Ericsson has won some major contracts, has maintained its position in markets where security concerns have led governments to exclude Chinese vendors, has invested heavily in the technologies that will define the next generation of wireless communications. But the competition is intense, and the outcome is far from certain. If Ericsson falters, if it loses the 5G race to Chinese competitors, the implications for the Wallenberg empire would be profound. Telecommunications has been central to the family's holdings for over a century. Losing that position would diminish not merely their wealth but their relevance to Sweden's economic future. European Union regulatory pressure continues to threaten the dual-class share structures that enable Wallenberg control. The arguments for harmonising corporate governance across member states have not gone away, and each new European Commission brings fresh scrutiny of arrangements that allow controlling shareholders to maintain power with minority economic stakes. Swedish governments have defended the national corporate governance model against Brussels pressure, but they cannot hold out indefinitely if the rest of Europe moves toward one share, one vote principles. The elimination of dual-class shares would not destroy the Wallenberg foundations or force them to sell their holdings, but it would transform them from controlling shareholders into significant minority investors, influential but not dominant, voices to be heard rather than powers to be obeyed. The entire architecture of the Wallenberg sphere depends on voting advantages that magnify economic stakes into controlling positions. Without those advantages, the sphere would fragment, its component companies drifting into genuinely dispersed ownership where the Wallenbergs would be large shareholders among many rather than the unquestioned rulers of Swedish industry. Public attitudes among younger Swedes show increasing skepticism toward concentrated economic power in general and toward the Wallenberg dynasty in particular. The deference that earlier generations extended to the family, the acceptance of their dominance as natural and beneficial, has eroded as information about their holdings has become more accessible and as international debates about inequality and oligarchy have reshaped public discourse. Young Swedes who came of age during the 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath, who have watched billionaire wealth grow while wages stagnated, who have encountered arguments about democratic accountability and corporate governance that their parents never heard, are less inclined to accept that a single family should control 40% of their nation's publicly traded companies. This generational shift may not produce immediate political consequences, but it shapes the environment in which the Wallenbergs will operate for decades to come. Comparing the Wallenbergs to other great business dynasties illuminates both what they have achieved and what they face. The Samsung controlling family in South Korea wields similar influence over their national economy. But South Korea is not Sweden, has not built a welfare state premised on egalitarian values, does not experience the same cognitive dissonance between concentrated ownership and democratic self-image. The Tata family in India has controlled their conglomerate for over a century, but India's political economy is fundamentally different, its tolerance for dynastic capitalism more deeply rooted in cultural traditions. The Wallenbergs occupy a unique position, an industrial dynasty in a social democracy, a concentration of private power in a society that celebrates equality, an anomaly that has persisted so long that it has come to seem normal even though examination reveals how strange it truly is. The third generation curse, the tendency for family fortunes to dissipate after the grandchildren of the founder take over, has claimed countless dynasties throughout history. The pattern is familiar. The first generation creates wealth through talent and hard work. The second generation, having witnessed that creation, maintains and expands it. The third generation, knowing wealth only as inheritance, lacks the hunger and discipline that built the fortune in the first place. The Wallenbergs have defied this pattern for 6 generations, maintaining control and expanding their holdings, long past the point where most family empires fragment and fade. Their success reflects the legal structures they created, the foundations and holding companies that insulate wealth from the dissipating forces of inheritance and division. It reflects the culture they cultivated, the training programs and family expectations that prepare heirs for responsibilities rather than indulgences. And it reflects luck, the absence so far of a truly disastrous generation, of heirs so incompetent or dissolute that they overcome all the structural protections the family has built. But past performance does not guarantee future results, in dynasties any more than in financial markets. The Wallenberg story forces a question that democracies rarely confront: how much concentrated power is acceptable? For a hengsty 8 years, one family has controlled Sweden's industrial economy, while Sweden built the world's most celebrated welfare state. They have produced both Holocaust heroes and Nazi collaborators. They have funded scientific breakthroughs and been fined billions for corruption. They have created hundreds of thousands of jobs and concentrated billions of dollars of control in foundation structures that pay no taxes and answer to no voters. The Rothschilds of Northern Europe, the Sassoons of Scandinavia, a family that owns a country that believes itself to be the world's most equal society. Is the Wallenberg model brilliant stewardship that has given Sweden stability and prosperity, or is it a permanent democratic deficit that Swedes have simply learned not to see? Andrei Oskar Wallenberg built his first bank in 1856 with a simple idea: if you control the money, you control the businesses. His great-great-grandchildren still run that empire. His great-great-great-grandchildren are being trained to take over. Dynasties do not ask for permission, they simply persist. And the Wallenbergs have outlasted every force that history has thrown at them. Wars, socialism, globalization, scandal. Will the 6th generation outlast democracy itself, or will democracy finally outlast them? The motto is still esse non videri, to be, not to be seen. Perhaps the most honest family slogan ever written. They have been hiding in plain sight for 48 years. Now you have seen them. The question is, what will Sweden do about it?